from the blackest corners of your mind, they call, pulling you deep into shadow, twisting your senses, keeping you from sleep. It's time to face your darkest fears. This is Tales to Terrify. Good evening, children of the night, and welcome. As of last weekend, our annual flash fiction contest is now officially in full swing. Our theme this year, in case it has yet to breach your psyche, explores some of the deepest, darkest depths of human terror, the ancient traditions birthed around the flickering flames of the first campfires, and maybe even before. It's yielded some of the more terrifying entities in fiction, and some we only pray are fictional. Our theme this year is folk legends and fairy tales, and it feels like one that's particularly ripe for spawning some exceptionally dark and gruesome tales. The real trick? Fitting it all into 1,000 words or less. This year we're doing something a little different, too. We've managed to snare a pair of experienced guest judges to join our roster, Julia and Amanda from Spirits Podcast. Spirits is a boozy podcast about mythology, legends, and folklore. Every episode, co-hosts Julia and Amanda mix a drink and discuss a new story or character from a wide range of places, eras, and cultures. So we'd be hard-pressed to find a pair more qualified to poke and prod your monstrosities like some otherworldly dog show. For more details on our flash contest, or to unleash your own mythic creation on the unsuspecting masses, or at least on our judging team, head over to talestoterrify.com/flashcontest. You'll find all the details you need to enter and a link to our submissions platform. One last thing before we dive into our fiction. I'd like to extend our deepest, darkest thanks to the newest member of our Patreon, Trisha Charisse. Thank you so much, Trisha. While the odd scrap of carrion is enough to keep our staff at bay, keeping the lights on really does rely on the generous support of listeners like you. If you'd like to join Trisha behind the veil, head over to patreon.com/talestoterrify and sign up. Our mortal souls will forever be in your debt. For tonight, we have a pair of stories for you, about a young couple struggling to escape the city they once called home, and a final girl willing to do whatever it takes to retain her status. Our first tale comes to us from Stetson Ray. Stetson Ray lives in the hills of East Tennessee and spends as much time as he can writing. His preferred Taco Bell order is as follows: 1 Mexican pizza, 1 cheesy gordita crunch, no lettuce, 1 cheesy bean and rice burrito, and 1 loaded beef nachos. Children of the night, join me for Stetson Ray's For Whom the Taco Bell Tolls, a Tales to Terrify original.
Ned and Amy sprinted into an alley and dove behind a dumpster. "Do you think they saw us?" Amy asked, her voice trembling. "No." They waited, red-faced and panting. Lights flashed at the end of the alley. "Stay quiet." Ned peeked peeked around the edge of the dumpster and saw a group of people appear at the head of the alley. He squeezed himself against Amy and whispered, "No matter what happens, just know that I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't save you from this. I'm sorry I—" From the street came a soul-shattering sound. Dogs barking. Dozens of chihuahuas. Amy sucked in a breath, prepared herself to scream, and Ned clamped his hand over her mouth. Voices echoed down the alley. Men arguing. "Shut up, you little rats," someone said, and the dogs whined as they were pulled away. The voices faded and the light disappeared. The people and the dogs were gone. "Come on," Ned said. "Let's get out of here before they come back." He stood and looked up the alley. He turned around, expecting Amy to be on her feet, but she wasn't. She looked like a child, her knees tucked into her chest, her eyes wide and watery. "Come on, we have to go." "Why?" Amy breathed. "What do you mean, why? If those people find us, they'll—" "I know what they'll do. You don't have to remind me." She barely resembled the woman Ned had married the year before. Then again, nothing looked the same as it had the year before. Things had changed. Society had changed. People had changed. No one was spared. You either change or you run, so Ned and Amy had decided to run. He knelt down and put his arm around her. "Please, we have to go." "Why?" she asked again. He couldn't think of a good reason. It was too late. Humanity was finished. It was over. It was all over. He finally said, "Because I don't want to die in this alley." "If only that were true," Amy muttered. "That's the worst part, isn't it? If only they would kill us. Death would be better." In the distance, more dogs barking, more people talking. Ned shot to his feet. "I'm begging you, Amy. I'm begging you." She looked up at him, and the hopelessness he saw in her eyes nearly gutted him. She slowly pushed herself off the ground. "Okay, I'm ready to run again." But maybe she was right. Maybe it would be better to. She leaned in and kissed him, the last kiss they would ever share. "I love you." "I love you too." Again, they ran down deserted city streets and through back alleys, ducking and darting and doing their best to stay hidden. The city was large, but they were almost out, and Ned was beginning to believe they might actually make it. "How long will it take us to reach Aunt Linda's cabin?" Amy asked. "I don't know. There are checkpoints set up on all the roads, so we won't be able to drive, but if we can find a boat, we can let the river carry us all the way there." "Are you sure that's safe? I mean, what if Linda—" "No. Aunt Linda rarely leaves her cabin, and I doubt she's ever even eaten a burrito." "I hope you're right. God, I hope you're right." They hurried down another street and rounded a corner and nearly ran into a strange-looking man. The man grabbed a little bronze bell that hung suspended around his neck, but before he could shake it and sound the alarm, Ned tackled him. The two of them struggled on the ground, rolling and grunting. The strange man was abnormally strong. Ned managed to get on top of him and pin him to the ground, but he knew he wouldn't be able to hold him for long. "Move!" Amy grunted, appearing beside them. She was holding something above her head. A manhole cover. Instantly knowing what she meant to do, Ned leaned away. The strange man was smiling when Amy brought the hunk of steel down on his head. His skull cracked open like an overstuffed chalupa, and the contents oozed onto the pavement. Amy dropped the manhole cover and fell to her hands and knees. Ned forced himself to his feet and struggled to catch his breath. "Thanks," he said. He didn't want to look But he couldn't help himself. Illuminated by the glow of streetlights, the dead man appeared to be completely normal, except for one feature. Amy said, "Ned, where are his brains?" She crawled over to the dead man and stuck her hands into the matter that had recently been inside the man's skull and held it up to the lights. "Beef? It's all beef! No brains at all, just lightly seasoned beef! No, don't touch it!" Ned grabbed her and pulled her away, beef falling from her hands in clumps. It had been days since he had eaten anything, and as repulsed as he was, the smell made his stomach growl. "We're almost there," he said, dragging Amy along. "We have to keep going." They walked on, and a few minutes later, Ned peered around a corner and saw a roadblock. The final checkpoint at the edge of the city. "We have to sneak around," he said, turning to Amy. But she was gone. Beside him stood a living doll, a caricature of a human being. She'd seen too much. Even if they reached Aunt Linda's cabin, Amy would be scarred for life. She'd never be the same. Still, they couldn't stop. Hand in hand, they crept down another alley and reached a tall fence. "If we can get over this fence, we should be able to sneak past them," Ned said. "You go first." Amy began climbing. From behind them came the sound of a bell ringing, high and bright. "Go!" Ned yelled, the last word he ever said to his wife. Amy climbed as the bell screamed behind her. When she reached the top of the fence, she tumbled over the other side and landed on a pile of trash. She raised her head just in time to see everything. A group of people descended on Ned. He tried to fight, but there were too many of them. They pinned him to the ground, and a large man wearing a cylindrical metal tank on his back knelt over Ned as another man forced Ned's mouth open. "This one is feisty," one of the men said. "Don't bother with mild. We'll need fire to calm him down." A nozzle was crammed into Ned's mouth. A valve was released, and taco sauce poured down his throat. "Stop!" Amy screamed, shaking the fence with both hands, but her protests did nothing to slow the sauce. In unison, the people chanted as Ned drowned, "Live Mas! Live Mas! Live Mas!" Ned went limp, and the people let him go. They waited in silence. Ned finally twitched and coughed up some sauce. The people helped him to his feet. More silence. More coughing. Then Ned said, "Live Mas!" Amy ran away screaming as the people clambered over the fence behind her. But they didn't catch her. She ran faster than she had ever had, adrenaline surging through her body. She left the city and its horrors behind, and around dawn, she crested a hill and took a final look back. Spotlights raced along the streets, beamed down from helicopters which circled the skies. Groups of people led by packs of chihuahuas prowled the city. The dogs had been trained to sniff out anyone who had escaped the initial purge. There was a Taco Bell on every corner. Strongholds built by an invading army, now monuments to a war that had been easily won. When Amy reached the river, she climbed inside an old John boat and let the current take her. Lying on her back, she drifted in and out of sleep. Just after sunset, she raised her head and spotted a cabin near the riverbank. She paddled the boat ashore and staggered up the sandy bank. She couldn't believe she had made it, and for the first time in days, she felt safe. The wind blew and carried a pungent smell to her nose. Inside the cabin, someone was cooking. Tacos, gorditas. Quesadillas. Her stomach rumbled. Tears streamed down her face. With nowhere left to go and nothing left to fight for, she decided to go inside and have something to eat.
That was Stetson Ray's For Whom the Taco Bell Tolls, as read by Curtis Michael Holland. Curtis is a gay Greek Black Indigenous Canadian-born expat. He teaches and directs theater and voice acts from his home studio and local studios in his home, Hong Kong. He's an all-or-nothing kind of guy. You can either find him surrounded by a million of his closest friends, or melting away in a sauna reading a scary book. Thank you, Curtis. Our second tale tonight comes from Patrick Barb. Patrick Barb is an author of weird, dark, and horrifying tales, currently living, and trying not to freeze to death, in St. Paul, Minnesota. His 2023 short story, The Scare Groom, was selected for Best Horror of the Year Volume 16. His short fiction is collected in The Children's Horror from Northern Republic Press and pre-approved for haunting from Keylight Books. His debut sci-fi horror novel, Abducted, is coming from Dark Matter Inc. later this year. Listen with me, children of the night, to Patrick Barb's Lakeside Ceremonials, first published in Tales from Between, October 2022.
Betty knew no one came to Camp Arbor during the winter, when snow blanketed paths snaking between trees. Cabins stood like plague houses, boarded up and forsaken. The camp and surrounding town of Arbor's Mill couldn't handle outsiders once ice and snow settled over the area. Even though she'd long ago abandoned her counselor t-shirt to the cleaning rag pile, Betty personified the Camp Arbor way. And after 30 years of living nearby, watching the campgrounds, she'd found, if not peace, then an order of sorts. All to have it thrown into jeopardy by the unaccounted-for arrival of those girls. It's not fair, them coming here. Not now. The girls' presence in Arbor's Mill, the questions they'd asked about accessing the campgrounds off-season, their youth and their beauty, all those factors combined to set in motion his return. Pressure to move up her normal timeline manifested like a vice around Betty's head. Her ears popped with every step taken across the ice-covered lake at the center of the campgrounds. I shouldn't be here. They shouldn't have come yet. It's too early. Given their slow, unsteady progress to the frozen lake's center, Betty had time to consider all of the things she'd rather be doing. Snuggling up under a checkered pattern blanket with Keith, lying by the fireplace at his bed and breakfast, letting him do the thing with his thumb pressing against her inner thigh. Keith was a good listener. Instead of chaste marshmallow-flavored firelight kisses and the touch of curly salt and pepper beard hairs against her neck, Betty contented with teeth-grinding pain ping-ponging through her aching, freezing muscles. Her atrophying joints crackled like campfire kindling at even the slightest bend. The heavy duffel bag she'd taken from the trunk of the nosy deputy's patrol car, filled with road flares and sundry items for assisting poor souls lost in the cold, caused her to stoop forward. She walked with a hunch like some tired old maid, which is just how I feel. But she couldn't stop. Stopping meant throwing away 30 years of sacrifices, and she'd worked too hard, given up too much to let that happen. It's such a shame. We're here when the lake's so miserable. Betty wished the girls waited until the days got longer and the sun's rays shredded the icy covering. In the summer, algae and sunscreen scents wafted off the water's surface, even when the camp was inactive. Out in the cold, her snot stuck fast between her nostrils and upper lip. She inhaled the copper-sweet scent of the deputy's blood diffused through the chill night air. The way the back of his head and everything inside misted the snow. Got him right before he made it to his radio, too. Then those girls understood I wasn't leading them out here for whatever film project they were hoping to make. Betty held Keith's shotgun in the crook of her right elbow, its padded butt pressed against her descending breast. She aimed its long, lewd barrel at the backs of those girls, all bundled up tight in thick winter coats and Etsy scarves, hair tucked under woolen caps. Those layers hid the decadence of skin, sin, and sex for two of them, and the unspoiled innocence of the other. But how to explain the swell of the good girl's belly, visible even under cold weather clothes, stretching the long white dress so she looked like half a snowman? "Move," Betty said, speaking as much to her troubled thoughts as to the outsider trio before her. Inside, she chastised herself for questioning the process. She reasoned he must sense something more in the girl from his vantage point at the bottom of the lake, peering up through the opaque lens of thick-sheeted ice. Sleeping in the embrace of still waters, he waited for them. Betty would bring them to him. It was their arrangement, as far as she understood it. "Please, don't do this, Miss Betty. Shauna's not okay." Shauna, the pregnant girl. Words came like machine gun bullets through the girl's chattering teeth. "Think my water broke. Fuck!" I'd never speak in such filthy terms. I was a good girl. No drinking, no drugs, no sex. It's why he chose me. So why choose her? Shauna learned some difficult truths about herself, her body, and the process of bringing life into the world over the 9 months since the doctors implanted the fertilized egg into her womb. She learned she was far too agreeable, going along with whatever her best friends Raylene and Z suggested because she knew they loved her almost as much as they loved each other. She also learned she'd need new shoes when the baby growing inside of her got the boot at last. Her feet had swelled up a size and a half. Sometimes Shauna wondered if she'd missed out on the fun part, foregoing sex and going right to being knocked up. Agreeing to surrogate for Raylene and Z seemed like a good idea. If not a good idea, then the right thing to do at least. She knew her friends would make wonderful moms, but they needed some time to get their lives together. That's where Shauna came in. She offered them a 9-month reprieve. But as the day approached, the couple and their surrogate learned another lesson. Having a baby was expensive as hell. Almost $10,000, Z said. But we have a plan, Raylene finished. It was the tag team approach they used, each one completing the other's sentences. We could sell custom videos. There's a whole mess of perverts online, desperate for salacious content. Think what they'd pay for videos, pictures, voice recordings of a pregnant virgin? But don't worry. We wouldn't make you do anything sexual. We'll film it somewhere exciting, too, like, did you ever hear about Camp Horror? Out on the ice, Shauna learned a new lesson. Everyone dies. And that didn't make her feel special at all. February winds slashed and howled, making it hard for Betty to concentrate or even think. She worried those distractions might cost her. After all, she had her secret rituals to perform. Rituals keeping her in his favor. In the summer, it went easier. Betty let trespassers, thrill seekers, and those too dumb to know better come to the lake in their own time. And they came, again and again, smelling of cherry lip gloss, bug spray, and teenage impossibilities. They were his required sacrifices, and Betty offered their unworthy bodies to his relentless slaughter. All except the virgins. Those would-be pretenders to her Queen of Summer throne. She kept them for herself. When she dispatched them, a tingling sensation traveled from between her legs, spreading like a crack in a mirror's glass surface. Is this what sex feels like? Do you feel this powerful? The pregnant girl, Shauna, had baby-fat cheeks to go with her plump belly. Yet she'd fought the hardest when Betty forced them out of the back of Keith's pickup truck, making sure they stepped over the dead deputy's body cooling in the slushy pink snow. She'd broken the girl when she poked the gun barrel against her rosy, wind-bitten cheek and traced a line down, stopping at her stomach. Betty chuckled to herself as she realized who the girl reminded her of. She was like the Betty of local legend, the last surviving counselor of the Camp Horror massacre, the sweet, innocent girl who went along with the story they'd told to her about herself, the one where she killed the masked man, sending the boogeyman to the bottom of the lake. But that was the story they told, not the story she lived. What if they knew how their story became the bait in our trap? Time and again, others came to the campgrounds, perhaps subconsciously drawn to the chance to take part in the Lakeside ceremonials. Betty, the real Betty, was always waiting, and she found the new girls lacking, unworthy of his attention. I'm the only final girl he'll ever need. Keith almost ruined everything before the three girls shook the snow from their boots or Betty saw their faces and knew they're the ones, his next ones. During their early morning cuddle time, a single "God dang it" from Betty proved a more jarring line of attack than a slap to the face or kick to the groin for Keith. Cut to the emotional quick, he sat on the edge of the bed, white undershirt stretched tight above his belly, argyle socks rubbing the hardwood, stringy black and gray pubic hairs matted and tangled with spilled seed, reaching his belly button. Betty pressed herself against the headboard and pulled white sheets to her chin, making her body a ghost. I told you, not inside me. I told you. Ah, geez, Bet. I kept it outside, but we were rubbing and it... If Keith hoped for sympathy, one look at the flushed red cheeks and the throbbing temple of the woman he called his girlfriend during the slow winter months in Arbor's Mill would have made it clear he'd have no such luck. I told you, we can't have sex. I'm a virgin. If you want, we can do it in the behind. When Keith lowered his eyes and shook his head back and forth from side to side, he made Betty feel like a child. Like she didn't understand the ways of the world. You know it counts as sex these days, right? He leaned forward, pawing for his gray flannel pants on the floor. It doesn't count for him. Then those girls pulled into the parking lot behind Keith's bed and breakfast, laying on their horn, announcing their presence to the world. From bed, Betty had a clear view out the window and down to the lot. She watched a brown bunny, late for hibernation or up too early, making a break for it, bounding across snowdrifts. After all the years, she'd learned to read the signs, the heralding of his return. Yes, I understand now. She made a quick study of the room, looking for anything sharp, anything to bind, bludgeon, or bash. During their initial encounter, she thought the fact she'd used her surroundings to her advantage was what kept her alive. Years later, she knew better. But she still believed it to be a good trait to possess. Bit early for out-of-towners, huh? Keith asked, letting the elastic band of his too tight cotton boxer briefs snap against his waist. The thick black leather belt he wore looped through his pants had snaked its way over to Betty's side of the bed. She glanced at the belt, considering how tight she could cinch it. Then she noticed the pillowcase behind her, damp and clinging with sweat. They'll do. She'd felt sorry for Keith after the deed was done. Not because he'd been slow to fight back, his eyes wet with tears, questions half formed on his blubbering lips. He'd been slow, but he fought back once he realized Betty's mind was more than made up. No, she'd felt sorry because it didn't need to happen. She wished he'd listened to her, wished he'd let things proceed as they always did. But he hadn't listened. He'd injected himself into the ritual, and as a result, he died. She prayed he hadn't ruined anything. The girls believed Betty ran the B&B, and why shouldn't they? She'd done nothing to dissuade them, and none of the locals passed through the bed and breakfast to say different either. Aside from it being the off-season, everyone in Arbors Hill except Keith had enough sense to keep their distance from Betty, as they didn't understand how she came through the Camp Horror massacre and then stuck around. They'll never understand why I stayed. For him. But Betty understood the role the townsfolk played. Their blind eyes turned aside, gave her a chance to prepare the way for his return. Sometimes the camp reopened under new management. Sometimes kids came to smoke, pop pills, and fuck. There was even one time a group of sick obsessives held a masked man-themed festival at the site. I can't do this. One of the girls, Raylene, turned and took steps away from the group, away from him. The other girl, Z, reached for her girlfriend. Their pregnant friend slumped toward the ice with one less set of hands holding her upright. Z's bare bluish hands shone through the moonlight. She grabbed Raylene's coat. Babe, don't! Oh! Shauna moaned from the ice, hands on her knees. She didn't look like much of a fighter anymore. Shauna's keening synced up with the pounding of his fists under the ice. There's too much work left, and not enough time. Z pulled her coat free. Raylene's eyes filled with fear, confusion. Betty figured the girl had imagined everything could still be okay. There's always one who believes that. Betty let the nightmare tableau play out longer, acting as voyeur, watching soap opera private moments unfolding. It was another of his lessons she'd put into practice for herself. Let them do the work for you. I can't, Z. I can't. She's crazy. She's gonna kill us all. But I'm not gonna walk to my death. I won't. The would-be runner took a few more tiny steps away, headed to the old dock where canoes would sit bumping against moss-covered pillars in warmer weather. Ray, please, don't leave me. Don't leave Shauna. Our baby. Betty couldn't pick out everything they said, and the intensity of their emotions confused her. Not like she'd never heard of two women in love. She'd just never seen it that way. Usually, what she witnessed added up to nothing more than shallow titillation. Co-eds tipsy on wine coolers exchanging topless kisses for the entertainment of grunting male companions. Raylene the runner made good on her threats. However, her rubber-soled boots against the slick surface of ice made for a wobblier escape attempt than she might have wanted. Shauna flopped onto her back, wool cap popping off her head and exposing damp blonde curls. Her cheeks wobbled, nostrils flared. The long white dress she'd worn, a costume for the movie or whatever it was those girls wanted to make, appeared soaked through with dark, mucousy stains. Frost-dappled embroidery held the material tight to swollen thighs. Her? Really? Oh my God, she's gonna make it. Z's whispered disbelief snapped Betty back to reality. Shoot, she said. A command and curse in one word. She hated that she'd let herself get distracted again. Taking a deep breath, Betty blew out cold air like pot smoke from a joint passed at a campfire. Raylene had already covered more ground in the time passed than Betty expected, and she wasn't sure about her accuracy at the ever-increasing distance. Still, she couldn't let the girl go. He wouldn't like it. She lined up her shot. Ice shifted under Raylene's feet. A mini earthquake rumbled through the ice. A black spray of lake water spurted out like a shaken soda can burst open in a freezer. Somehow Raylene managed to stay upright. Her last mistake. Betty's heart pounded with reverent joy. A sign. He was there. He bought her more time. She pulled the trigger with confidence. One step, 2. Then the girl who tried to run fell face first on the ice. The smack of her nose breaking and chin splitting carried across the dark, so it sounded as though she'd fallen at their feet. Betty's ears rang, so the screams of the other girls sounded like they came from underwater, like they were already under the ice with him. Betty took a step back, watching the dead or dying girl. She allowed herself a smile. Then the back of her boot crossed something wet and sticky. She lost her balance, falling hard on her ass against the ice. Another fissure broke open in the frozen surface, and the shotgun slid right for it. Betty scrambled for it, but it was already gone. Black clouds moved over the moon, obscuring what went on out at the lake. Betty's hands slapped against the ice. Then she held them to her face. Blood caked the wool of her mittens. The other girls were gone. She pulled herself to her feet, slipping a few times in the blood, piss, and shit. Stamping her foot, cracks rippled through the ice. Black clouds blew away from the moon, and she blinked, taking in the horror show tableau before her. Z pulled Shauna away, but in doing so, she'd brought her closer to him. No, no, no! Betty ran. She fell. Her teeth sliced through her chapped lips, and her ears rang with cathedral bell clangs. She wanted to scream, "Stop! I'm not ready for you!" But blood filled her mouth, spilling down her chin. The masked man crawled from the hole made by his bloodless fists, knocking aside broken chunks of ice on his way to the surface. Z, stripped to her undershirt, stepped in front of him, blocking the path to Shauna. The girl's arms looked like twigs compared to the blocky, golem-like proportions of the masked man. "Please don't! My baby!" she said. Betty slipped again. Her palm slapped the ice. Wet with blood and sick, the wool stuck fast. She pulled and pulled, trying to get herself free. Crimson-soaked threads dangled from her palm, fibers embedding under the skin. Somehow she made it. She didn't try to get up again, opting instead to crawl, hands and knees flailing like she'd forgotten how to move. She wouldn't stop. He'd come back, and she wanted to be there. Closer and closer, until she could reach out from the dark and touch him. Under the ice, waiting in still and silent waters, his wounds washed clean, leaving skin smooth and rubbery, softer than she expected every time. When he picked Z up and tore her arms from their sockets, a shudder passed through Betty's body. The masked man tossed Z aside, white hands stained red, like my hands. He took plodding steps toward the last girl left. Last, but no, not the final girl. Wrapped up in her friend's discarded coat and sweater, Shauna didn't look into the masked man's covered visage, as though she didn't understand what an honor it was to have his attention. Betty pulled herself up one last time. She knew she had to fight. After all, she was his final girl, and it's what the final girls did. They fought back when the end came. Ice crunched under his feet with each step. Black eyes under a cheap Halloween mask focused on Shauna. Her arms were cradled to her chest. A tiny naked form wiggled, kicking under the moonlight. A long membranous growth dangled from the newborn and ran along Shauna's deflating stomach, disappearing back inside her. Closer, closer. Finally, his shadow stretched across Shauna and the child. Then, the new would-be chosen one raised her eyes from the baby and beheld the masked man. But she didn't understand. "It's a girl." Betty rose from behind Shauna and put her hands around the girl's head. She wrenched, twisting and pulling where the skull met her neck. Harder, harder. Then there was a crack, like the masked man's cement block feet tromping on the ice. She collapsed beside the dead girl, panting, crying, but happy. She'd kept her place for another year. "I'm still his final. The corpse-pale fist slammed through the ice, missing Betty's head by inches. She looked up and caught sight of a fire raging in the coals of the masked man's undying eyes. She'd never witnessed that look up close before. It didn't make any sense to her. He always saved that for his sacrifices. She rolled aside, avoiding a foot intended to shatter her arm. On her feet, she yelled, at him. "What are you doing? They're all dead. I'm the survivor. Now I kill you and we do this again in a year." But he kept moving toward her. Betty looked around, facing darkness on every side. No answers waited for her in the sky, nor under the killing moon. She heard a whimper, a phlegm-filled cough, a haunting cry in the night. Realization settled in, ripping away Betty's teenage dreams. The baby. The masked man shoved her down. Betty cracked the back of her skull against the ice. Blood gushed, red mingling with white and blue. He twisted Betty's ears hard. Then he slammed her face into blackened ice and slush. Her broken teeth sprinkled the ice like coarse salt crystals. Wearing a crimson mask of her own, Betty studied her surroundings through a painful fog. She couldn't feel her lips, but a smile etched across her insides. I always was good at finding something to fight back with. She rolled to the side, escaping another attack. Bloody woolen fingers reached for the shivering babe. Betty made a fist around the bruise-colored umbilical cord. The baby screamed, an ear-piercing shriek of defiance. In reply, his cry emerged as a guttural, waterlogged moan. On his knees, the masked man clawed his way to Betty. No weapons were needed. He'd pull her apart with inhuman hands. But Betty was a survivor. She wriggled behind the masked man. She wrapped the fleshy cord around his neck and pulled, tighter and tighter. Finally, it was the masked man's turn to fight. He tried to get free, tried to get away. His shambling giant steps brought Betty to her tiptoes. The cord tightened between her palms. The masked man's attempts pulled the crying newborn from Shauna's lifeless arms. Betty pulled the cord tighter, tighter. She willed herself to fall, her ass hitting the ice with a crack. She couldn't tell if it came from the frozen surface or her tailbone. The masked man moved with an uncertain gait, awoken too early from his slumbers. Rusted metal at the tips of his work boots cut through the ice. But he slipped. Black eyes bulged under the mask. A swollen tongue pressed against the cloth covering. Like a deflated balloon, air whistled out and he crumpled. The ice snapped, a huge sheet sticking straight up to the sky. Betty's monstrous attacker slid under the ice, back into the water. She scrambled away from the spreading dark waters. She looked at the hands that had killed the masked man. Except they didn't kill him. The baby's cries grew fainter and fainter. As the masked man sunk into impenetrable darkness, the child's cord remained wrapped around his neck. The cord killed him. The baby girl. She's the one. Betty bit into the cord, cutting through fat and gristle, biting, pulling, tearing. A heavy hand wrapped around her ankle. Of course. Always one final scare. She kicked back, heel connecting with soft, spongy tissue. The masked man became an afterthought. He'd left her, and Betty wanted to move on. She crawled from the ice and scooped up the naked babe, wrapping her up in the coats. Under an unflinching lunar gaze, Betty held the child close. She found the duffel bag. Moving to the edge of the lake, she put the baby and the coats inside the duffel, creating a makeshift cradle. She fired a flare into the sky, watching it arc over the treetops. Then she lit the remaining ones, setting them in the snow around the baby. There was a good enough chance the townsfolk would notice and come to the child's rescue. None of them were smart enough to grasp the role they played, but they always gave flawless performances. Once his work was complete, they'd come for the final girl. But this isn't his work. It's mine. Blood droplets froze to her broken face. Betty said a prayer to a God she didn't believe in, pleading for the newborn's survival. She envisioned a time years later, baby girls all grown up, heading to a summer camp like Camp Arbor. Sweet, innocent baby girl, haunted by a phantom face, a dream memory of the bloody, broken woman who'd killed her family. Ice crumbled under Betty. She didn't fight, but let herself sink into the lake. It's not death. It's a baptism, accepting a new role, accepting a new name. The Ice Queen. Betty liked how that sounded. The Ice Queen's blue-black lips moved, making a silent promise to her final girl. She'd be waiting.
That was Patrick Barb's Lakeside Ceremonials, as read by Amy Paonessa. Amy Paonessa has been the producer and host of The Bloodlust, a horror movie review podcast, since 2014. She has narrated stories for various other podcasts, including Knife Point Horror and the Alexandria Archives. She's thrilled to read for Tales to Terrify, especially because she credits the podcast with reigniting her love of horror fiction. You can contact Amy through her website, thebloodlust.net. Thank you, Amy. Well, children of the night, the hour is late, and we've run out of tales to tell. For now. Tales to Terrify is made possible by the tremendous generosity of our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. Incredible fans like Lestle Baxter, Amanda Carrillo, Amanda Gottfried, and Orion D. Hegre, whose generous support keeps these lights on and flickering ominously. If you're not a supporter, head over to patreon.com/Tales to Terrify. You'll find all kinds of perks, like ad-free episodes, bonus content, and one-of-a-kind collectibles. Every dollar goes back into this show, and we appreciate your support so much. Want another way to support the show that doesn't cost you a cent? Head over to Podchaser, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts and drop us a 5-star review. You'll not only put an unnaturally wide smile on our faces, but help new listeners discover our terrifying tales too. You can show your love of the show out in the world with some Tales to Terrify merch. TalesToTerrify.com/merch will take you to our TeePublic store, where we've got a great collection of creepy custom and curated designs. Tales to Terrify is produced by Seth Williams, Meredith Morgenstern, Andrew Gibson, Crystal Hammond, Spencer Disparty, and myself, Drew Sebastini, with original theme by Nebulous Entertainment. Tales to Terrify is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Join us again next week as we become one with the darkness with more Tales to Terrify.